Ballot access expert Richard Winger is with us today. Richard, I don't think it would be exaggerating at all to say that you might be the nation's foremost ballot access expert. Is that fair to say, would you think?
Well, there's probably nobody else that spent 55 years digging into it. So
It is kind of peculiar.
Monomania, that probably is a true statement.
Yeah. What got you interested? What accounts for this particular passion? It is kind of unusual to focus on something so specific.
When I was in college, I was fascinated by the minor parties of the day. This was in the mid-'60s. And at the time, there were only 3 nationally organized minor parties that actually ran candidates, and none of them had any prestige at all, or even attention. There were the Socialist Labor Party, the Socialist Workers Party, and the Prohibition Party. And I was fascinated by the activists in these parties because I thought, how can they keep their morale up? How can they keep going? And who votes for these parties? And I looked at the election returns. I was surprised to see how many votes they got. So that's what I was interested in. And then since I was interested in the election returns, I wanted to figure out, well, how come their presidential candidates are in the ballot in some states and not others? That's when I started paying attention to the ballot access laws.
Right. And I became acquainted with you back in 2012. Do you remember how and why that came to be?
Did you have something to do with the Justice Party?
That is correct. When Rocky Anderson, the former mayor of, I think, Salt Lake City, started the Justice Party, I got excited, and this may sound like a weird reason, but it was the name that lured me in, the Justice Party. And, I didn't share your passion to the extent that you did, but I always thought it was weird that we're kind of run by 2 mafia families known as the Democrats and the Republicans. And, I was a Ralph Nader supporter, was just very interested with the idea of expanding the possibilities. And so when I heard about the Justice Party, I got interested, but it turned out all the people involved were just a bunch of lunatic leftists, and it really was nothing any different, and it was really squandering a good name on a bunch of kooks. But one good thing came out of it, which was we filed a lawsuit, and the ACLU represented us, and the issue was how long it takes to get for a new party to get on the ballot in the state of California. And at the time, it was a little over 10 months. And that made it very difficult, bordering on impossible, because you need a certain amount of signatures. And to get, a successful signature drive, people need to be excited and interested. And they don't get that interested until it's close to election day. So having to get it all done more than 10 months in advance was very difficult because nobody was interested. So we filed a lawsuit saying that they required way too much time, and we won. And I can't remember the exact, I think they chopped it down to 4 months. Maybe you know. Do you know what it is in California now?
Yes, because of the lawsuit that you were instrumental in starting, and I remember now, and I should have remembered that before. You were a hero, and the old deadline was, well, in years when the primary was in March, the deadline was in October of the year before the election. Crazy, more than a year before, and now it's July of the election year.
Yeah, that's much more reasonable. So at the time we filed the lawsuit, only 7 new parties had made it onto the ballot since 1953, and only 1 new party since 1995. So my great heroic accomplishment, thank you for acknowledging it, I'll take a bow, is actually only useful if anybody is taking advantage of it. So I've kind of lost interest in the issue. You're still the guy who's on the case. Have there been any new parties or any attempts at new parties?
Well, there's been attempts, but none of them has worked yet.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody has taken advantage of the Justice. By the way, it was 2 parties in the case, the Justice Party and the Constitution Party. Nobody's taken advantage of it yet.
Yeah, right. There were other plaintiffs. I was the lead plaintiff or the lead troublemaker, and the ACLU got these other plaintiffs added on too. John Gabry as an individual and one or two others as well. Because we scheduled the interview, so I was digging it up on the internet to refresh my own memory. So don't be too hard on yourself for not remembering the details. Even I didn't remember the details, and I was the troublemaker. All right, so we're here to talk about Kanye West running for president. Thank you for agreeing to do it. You were reluctant, and I understand why you aren't sure that he's serious. But I was able to convince you because I said, well, I'm not sure seriousness is the right way to frame it. I think the potential to have an impact is what makes this worth discussing. And Kanye West is obviously very famous. And the first step to being influential is being able to get attention. And he certainly knows how to get attention. And just a couple of days ago, for the first time in his life, he registered to vote in Wyoming. And let's take a look at that.
There's a lot of people who think they can't vote because they're a convicted felon, but they actually can ask for their rights back.
Yep.
Why do some other states make it so complicated to vote?
Well, the statutes are set up by legislature. So the people that they've elected to the House of Representatives and senators are the ones that set up, they have bills, they set up those statutes.
How do we get that changed in the states where it is made extremely complicated?
I think it starts with legislature. They have to get the statutes for each state changed. It's not uniform all the way across. Each state has their own way of doing things and the way they work through the process.
All right, so he's talking about what it takes to register to vote. Now, compared to that, what's the story on what it takes to get on the ballot in different states? So I know you can't get into every single state, but can you just kind of paint a picture for us?
Generally speaking, an independent presidential candidate has to go out in the streets with petitions and hope that enough people will sign them to fulfill with the law. Now, here's why I don't think he's serious. In 24 states, you can't even start to petition until you've chosen your candidates for presidential elector, because they all have to be put on the petition form. And when Ross Perot declared in March 1992 that he was going to be an independent presidential candidate, the first thing he had to do was find presidential electors. Now, Ross Perot was extremely popular. His problem was not finding people to be electors. He didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And he thought, well, I've got to come up with some way to choose presidential electors in a fair manner. So he set up field offices all over the country, in some states, many offices. And he invited all his supporters to come to their nearest office. And then they worked out a democratic way to decide who should be his candidates for presidential elector. And that was not easy. It took a whole month after he declared. It took a month to come up with the list of 55 electors in California. And you can't start until you have them. So if Kanye were serious, he would be organizing his supporters to find a way to pick his presidential electors. And if he's not doing that, he can't get started.
Well, all right, you're talking about the electors. Isn't there another way too, which is from write-ins? People can. Is it not true that in every state, I believe, that he could be written in, or only in some states, or what's the story on that?
It's the same deal. To file as a declared write-in candidate, you have to give the state forms, and you have to include a list of presidential electors. Now, the voters don't have to write in the presidential elector candidates, but the government will not count your write-ins unless you've done that paperwork. And already the deadlines for that, they're absurdly early in a few states, but already in Indiana and Florida, if you're going to be a write-in for president, you got to file this month. So again, he's got to, I don't think he's given any thought to presidential electors, and that's a big problem.
Right. So the deadline's coming up. Have any deadlines already passed?
Yeah. In fact, I'm afraid, this is speculation, but I'm afraid his announcement has made things worse. 2 days after he said he was going to run, the Fourth Circuit, in a a terrible decision, issued a ruling upholding the March 3rd petition deadline for independent presidential candidates in North Carolina. This totally shows disrespect for the U.S. Supreme Court precedent, Anderson versus Celebrezze. In 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court said in Anderson versus Celebrezze that March 20th is unconstitutionally early. That was a case from Ohio. Ohio only required 5,000 signatures, but they were due March 20th. And the Supreme Court went all through U.S. history and said it's important that people can enter the race in the middle of the year, and shutting the door as early as March 20th would, well, it would just cement the status quo. So for the Fourth Circuit to say March 3rd is okay, even though the Supreme Court said March 20th is not okay, is a shocking failure to do their job. I have a hunch they put out that opinion 2 days after Kanye announced. There are 3 liberal Democratic judges who did that. I just have a feeling they rushed it out because of what Kanye did, and they perceive this is a little trick by the Trump side to hurt Biden. And I can't prove it, but that's
yeah,
what I think.
a lot of people are speculating that whether or not Trump is involved or whether or not it's just Kanye West motivation. The idea is to help Trump and hurt Biden, take away votes, in particular black votes. We had John Solomon, who's an independent journalist, tweet that one of the Trump campaign advisors said the idea here is to siphon black votes away. And then Trump reply to that shouldn't be hard. Corrupt Joe has done nothing good for black people. And will.i.am is a very popular entertainer, an artist, and he seems worried. It's a dangerous thing to be playing with. If you're not serious, you don't play with that, especially now. Like, what the fuck? Seriously. I don't even know what community service you do. Boys, does somebody get paid every time they mention the word like? Is there somebody behind that? Maybe George Soros. But seriously, is there not a potential upside to this, Richard, in the sense that aside from the one particular outcome of the lawsuit you mentioned, couldn't the opposite happen too, which is that just like I was motivated to get involved in that lawsuit back in 2012, couldn't this issue be highlighted that it takes way too long? And even though there may not be time to correct it between now and this election day, couldn't it lead to making the deadline closer to election day?
Well, there's already plenty of lawsuits on that subject going on. Plenty. At all times, all the time, at least 1/3 of the states are in court over their ballot access laws. Probably by now it's half the states, and more lawsuits are about to be filed. We don't need Kanye to get these lawsuits going. They're already going.
Right. So do you see any potential upside to what Kanye West is up to? And although we're not even quite sure what he's up to, but to the extent you can imagine, do you see any potential upside?
Well, I hadn't really thought about that. And maybe if I thought about it, I could come up with something, but I can't right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that if we consider increasing participation to be a good thing for democracy, there's potential upside there. You know, I think a lot of times some folks who are very serious about this topic are a little bit elitist about it, and they don't fully appreciate that sometimes when you're joking around or you're looking at, like, say, a scandal of a politician getting divorced or something like that, this is what, you know, a headline in the tabloids, this is what gets people who aren't otherwise interested to pay attention. And sure, there may be the low IQ segment of the population, but is democracy about only smart people participating, or is it about as many people as possible participating?
Oh, it's definitely about as many people as possible. The theoretical reasons for democracy go all the way back to antiquity, and there were lots and lots of civil wars in past civilizations. And, you know, finally, people thought, well, this is pretty horrible. This is bloody. This is ruining our resources. Why, instead of fighting, why don't we just count up the number of forces on each side? And it should be obvious who would win if we fought a battle. So let's not fight the battle. Let's just go with the bigger number. So that's why only men could vote in practically every society that had voting at all for the longest time. But on the other hand, you know, if Kanye West does get people interested in the process, but then he doesn't appear on the ballot, well, what's that going to do? That could disillusion more people than were disillusioned before.
All right, you're the editor of Ballot Access News, and we're flashing the website address now, ballot-access.org. And I wanted to ask you about a couple of other stories on your website right now. But before I do, just a couple of more questions about Kanye West. As I said earlier, I guess, you know, there are different deadlines and, you know, somewhat different factors from state to state. To affect the election, which, you know, I think a lot of people expect to be close, it seems to me that if Kanye West got onto the ballot in some amount of states more than zero, it could make the difference. So I assume you may not know every single deadline by heart, but you probably know roughly what it takes. Can you see him getting on the ballot in some states, even though he's starting very late?
Yes, in 2016, there was a presidential candidate named Evan McMullen, and he didn't start till August 11th, and he got on, no, August 8th, and he got on in 11 states. There are a few states with September deadlines, and the vast majority are in August. But, you know, when people try to figure out what is the effect of such and such a person being on the ballot, which major party does he hurt the most, it's not really easy to figure that out. There was a famous political scientist who showed by real evidence that in 1948, when Henry Wallace, the progressive, ran against Harry Truman and Tom Dewey, Henry Wallace helped Harry Truman. In fact, he said Dewey would have won except for Henry Wallace. Now that contradicts all the conventional wisdom that people on the left take away from Democrats. And there's other examples too, but I really get frustrated when people just have a total assumption that a left candidate takes away from Democrats or a black candidate takes away from Democrats. It's not that simple.
All right. So you're saying it's possible that if Kanye West gets on the ballot and runs his strange candidacy, however he runs it, that it could actually help Biden, you think?
Yes, it's unknowable. It depends on what he says, how he campaigns, how much attention he gets. I guess he'd get a lot.
Oh,
I'm not into popular culture, and I didn't really understand how important he was when this started.
Yeah, that's why I think if these other people who weren't famous at all got on 11 states by starting as late as they did, somebody like Kanye West in the age of Twitter and every other way of reaching the public certainly has the ability to do just as much as those unknowns did.
Okay, yeah.
You're not happy about it, but we're here to be realistic, right?
Well, you know, he's just got to come up with a real platform and a serious attempt to explain why people should vote for him. What does he really stand for? And I just don't think that he's done that yet. Maybe you've noticed that he has. Maybe I'm wrong, but.
Well, I don't think he's capable of articulating much. But on the other hand, I think he doesn't have to articulate much to make an impact. Now, take, for example, that video we showed earlier. You know, there wasn't much to it, but he did highlight that it was easy to register to vote. And, you know, millions of people see it. And it's not hard to see that it might inspire X amount of people to vote. And if he does a few other things like that, you know, it adds up. And I'm not a Kanye West fan at all. I mean, but I just recognize what his status is.
Well, just because you're famous and just because your name is on the ballot doesn't mean you get a big vote. In 1952, conservatives put General Douglas MacArthur in the general election ballot for president in 7 states. Well, MacArthur was huge in 1952. He gave the keynote address to the Republican convention that year. Truman had fired him the year before, but he got a tiny vote, not even a tenth of 1%.
Right.
And also there was a party called the National States Rights Party, and they put Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus on the ballot in 1960 in 4 states. And he was very famous, you know. Maybe
Right.
people don't remember him, but if people
Yeah.
are old enough, they remember him. So anyway, he got a tiny, tiny vote. So just having your name in the ballot without a campaign is not going to get hardly any votes.
Okay, fair enough. There's one very serious issue, actually, that I think is important. If that's for me, tell them I'm not home.
It'll stop in 3 more rings.
3 more rings. All right, 1, 2, 3. One more. All right. And that is the Democratic Party taking it for granted that they have the black vote. That is an issue that Trump has been gnawing away at, and there's a certain amount of notable individuals, including African Americans, but not only, who are Trump supporters. And, they're directly challenging that notion. And Trump pushed some legislation about prison reform and has done some other things that are, at least arguably, are beneficial to the African American community. So you couple that existing climate with Kanye West, who is a black man who has already established himself as somebody who likes Donald Trump. And I think that if you put it all together, you see, well, maybe Democrats shouldn't take the black vote for granted. And I think that's a good thing, actually. It would give black people more leverage if they were to take the position, go ahead and earn my vote, as opposed to it being taken for granted. What do you think about that?
You're right that everybody needs leverage. You're right about that. And let's just wait and see who the Democratic nominee for vice president is going to be. If it's a black person, of course, that'll affect what you're talking about.
Well, I'm going to guess that person's name rhymes very closely with Kamala Harris.
I'm sorry, that'll only ring 3 times. I could take the phone off the hook, but then it would be like answering it, so I better not. Sorry.
All right, no problem.
So, well, that's an interesting speculation, but also I perceive that the COVID-19 crisis is even worse for Black and Latino people than white people, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. And I perceive that Trump does not appear to be giving good leadership on that. So I would think that that would factor into how Black people decide who to vote for.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a huge factor, the COVID-19 pandemic. And, not just how you perceive it, but how voters in general perceive it. And that's also a bit unpredictable because we don't really know to what extent that's going to change between now and Election Day. So I wouldn't bet on anything.
Well, I must admit, this is the most interesting year of my adult life.
Yeah.
Don't you think? Maybe you too.
Absolutely. That's one reason that I'm a Trump supporter. It's for the same reason when I'm watching an award show on TV that I always root for whoever's going to give the most humorous acceptance speech. I want them to win. I don't care if they deserve it or not. I like to be entertained.
But maybe that's what life is all about. Maybe the natural system that set up the universe, it's really all about entertainment. Because it's all temporary anyway. It's only a movie. We're all going to die. What happens next? We don't know. So,
the enemy is boredom. So I was looking at Ballot Access News, your website, earlier today, and I noticed a couple of stories that caught my attention. and I wanted to just get a quick take from you on it. One is there was a lawsuit in Texas about the Republican state convention that the Republican Party wanted to hold in person, and they sued. It seems to me like that is the sort of thing that could be relevant throughout the country. Anything you can say about that?
Well, the Texas Republican State Convention was expected to attract 6,000 people into an indoor room that social distancing just wouldn't be possible. That's why the city said you can't do it. And then the party sued. And so far, the judge says, well, I read about the hospitals filling up, all the ICU units. I'm going to go with the city here. And then the party said they were appealing. But on the other hand, the thing is supposed to be tomorrow. So I keep watching the news to see, is there going to be a state court of appeals decision this afternoon? Maybe so. And then, of course, we have all the question about the Republican National Convention, part of it in Jacksonville. They may have to give up on that, too.
Right. Well, they're talking about doing that outside, but then they have weather issues. If they do it outside, it's very hot and it could rain. That's not really conducive to having a successful convention. So I don't know what they're going to do. How do you think this affects Biden and Trump? As far as does it matter as far as the ultimate outcome of the election?
Well, I think to the extent the Democratic Party is being a little more sensible about its national convention, they've just said the delegates can vote electronically.
Right.
That worked fine. That's already worked this year for 3 smaller parties. The Green Party yesterday used an electronic convention. The Libertarians did at the end of May, and the Constitution Party did at the beginning of May. All 3 parties had very successful process, and yet the Republican Party is just digging in its heels. They certainly haven't talked about letting their delegates vote electronically, but we'll see what they decide.
Well, when you're talking about delegates, to me, voting electronically seems pretty reasonable. But that makes me think about the election. And there's an issue about voting by mail. Now, I don't know if this is exactly within your area of expertise, but do you have any thoughts about that particular controversy, voting by mail?
Yes, I live in California, and you do too. And we're very familiar with voting by mail. It works very well. Every mail ballot that is sent in to the elections department, the signature on the outer envelope is checked against the signature on the registration form. So people have all sorts of fears about fraudulent votes, but the point is, okay, suppose somebody gets your ballot. Suppose the postal person gives it to your neighbor, and the neighbor's a crook, and the neighbor knows what your signature looks like, and the neighbor votes for you and signs your name, and he or she knows how to fake it. But the voter is going to not get his or her ballot, so will complain to the elections department. The elections department will give them another one. So then 2 ballots would come in for 1 voter, the crooked one and the real one. So the DA would investigate, and there would probably be fingerprints on the phony one. They could probably figure it out. And the person who committed that fraud could face a felony with years in prison. I just don't think that's a real problem. I do not think that sort of fraud is going to happen.
Okay, so as you explained that, I was kind of struggling to follow how it would actually be verified. In the scenario you just described, is the voter's vote being noticed by the authorities, or only that they voted for somebody? Well,
the voter signs the outside of the envelope, but we still have a secret ballot in this country, and they're not going to. They separate the outer envelope from the stuff inside, so they're not ruining your secret ballot.
Right. So you think that anonymity, how do you pronounce that word, will still be preserved, and they'll just verify only that the person voted?
Yes.
And so you're saying you don't think it'll happen because of the risk of a severe penalty. But is it really likely that anybody who perpetrated such a fraud would be caught? I mean,
Sure.
you're just getting
Because
an
if two ballots come in from the same voter,
yeah.
that'll be investigated. You know, they really, in San Francisco where I live, they really do investigate. I had a friend whose adult son lived with him. They had the same name and the same address. Now, this involves in-person voting, but the son came in to vote at the polling place, and he accidentally signed in his father's line instead of his line on the roster. And they caught it, and they opened an investigation for fraud because the signature didn't match. Well, they, of course, explained it. So that taught me that, yeah, they enforce it.
Well, a couple of points, Richard. First of all, it seems to me very difficult to actually catch somebody who did that. You've got an envelope. Let's take your assumption, you know, 2 envelopes, 2 signatures, one's probably real, one isn't. I don't know what they actually do to find the person who perpetrated the fraud. And the other issue is if it happens in any great numbers, you've got yourself a time problem, right? I mean, you can't. How do you know who won the election if there's any significant number of people that did that?
Well, I assume you've used fingerprints to figure out who handled the crooked ballot. And the point is, we've been doing this in California. Anybody who wants to vote absentee can, you know.
Right.
We've been doing that for 40 years. And if it was a problem, we would have known about it already.
Right.
And there's plenty of other states that have been doing this for a long time, too.
Right. And I assume you feel the same thing or feel similarly about voter ID?
Well, that relates back to my little anecdote about the father and the son. California doesn't require voter ID, but people say, okay, you wouldn't, if you were going into a store, the store wouldn't be that trusting. But the point is the store doesn't have a picture of everybody's signature, and the voting people do.
Right.
So if they compare your signature in the roster at the polls with the signature in the voter registration form, that is a form of voter ID. Your signature is your voter ID.
Do you think that the people sitting there are looking closely at the signature?
No, they do a check later.
Later, yeah. Well, here's the thing. I mean, you know, life is always about trying to strike a good balance between competing considerations. So the argument is, well, it kind of suppresses the vote if you're going to require them to have ID. But it seems to me that the most reasonable way to strike that balance is just to make it easy to get an ID. How about that?
You're right. That's the perfect solution. The government should give everybody his or her ID. And that would be great. That would be the best.
All
but
right.
They don't. You have to go out and get it yourself.
I induced you to tell me I'm right at least twice in this interview, so I'm very pleased with how this went. Thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to say? Let's get your website up one more time, ballotaccess.org. And as Richard and I both agreed, he is the nation's foremost ballot access expert. Anything in particular that you want to point out coming up in that world?
Oh, there's so many things. There's lawsuits. If people are interested in this subject at all, I do think it would be rational for people to check my blog, you know, every few days, because things are happening every day. So thanks so much, Jeff. I really enjoyed this. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Same here, Richard. All the best to you.
This counts as in person. It's fine.
Yeah, you know, it's like the Corona handshake with the elbows.
Yeah. And where's your mask?
All right. Take care. Talk to you soon.
Okay.